Hi, everyone, and thanks for sticking in there to this late session. I'm going to be talking to you today about model-based imputation and use of administrative records. In the SIP, I'm here with Ruth Serafin. We are in the Survey Improvement Research Branch in the Social, Economic, and Housing Statistic Division. And our branch is responsible for all of the model-based imputation that you see in the SIP. So for today's presentation, I'm going to give a brief overview of imputation in the SIP, a little historical backgrounds. I'm going to cover our sources of administrative data and how we use them. And then I'm going to hand it over to Ruth, who is going to handle the nuts and bolts of our methodology and our modeling. And then at the end, talk a little bit about the future direction of imputation in the SIP. So just as some background, there's a couple of different types of non-response in the SIP, household, person, and item non-response. Household is basically, we can't find the whole household. Maybe the unit was demolished or something like that. That's handled mainly through weighting adjustments. The other two, person and item, we use our imputation methods. Person non-response happens when someone is a member of the household, but for some reason, they don't want to answer any questions, they're not available, or there's not someone in the household to give answers on their behalf. So like a husband answering for a wife or something like that. So basically, we don't have any information about that specific person. The other type is item non-response, and that happens when a person is answering the survey questions as normal, but they don't want to, or we just don't have information about one question or several questions. It could be the case that someone just didn't feel comfortable telling us about where they work or how much they make or something like that. So that can kind of come in different pockets all over the survey. And so with the person and item non-response, there's a couple of different types of imputation that you might encounter in the SIP. The first is model-based imputation, which is the focus of our talk today. And then we also have sequential hot deck imputation, which is basically we find information from a donor that matches on specific characteristics and use that donor's value to fill in the missing information. And then there's also cold deck imputation. It's generally like the mean or the most common answer for the question. It's generally just used to initialize the hot deck matrix, and it's generally used as a last resort, so you won't find it that much. And the reason why I talk about the different types of imputation is because SIP underwent a redesign in 2014, and prior to 2014, solely relied on hot deck imputation to kind of fill in the values. And then there's a couple of problems with that. When you use hot deck imputation, it's really limited on the number of stratifying variables. So we have things like sex, race, age categories, if there's kids, if they're married. And then there's also concerns about data that's not missing at random. So as you can imagine, someone who answers all of the questions on the survey could look very different than someone that doesn't, right? So we don't want to use necessarily that kind of person who answers everything to fill in missing values, because that could introduce some bias, right? So with the 2014 redesign, there's three main challenges. One, we need better data to inform the imputations, maybe something that's not subject to this missing at random issue. Two, there's a need to cover a really wide variety of topics and process them in a timely manner, right? So SIP asks lots of questions, and we have to schedule this and get out this data in a way that is timely. And then the last is, well, we need better imputation methods. What can we use that is better than hot deck imputation? So with those three challenges in mind, and with the idea of, well, we first need these better data to inform the imputations, where would we get them from? In an ideal scenario, right, we could go out into administrative data, whether it comes from the IRS or the SSA, and take that information and just fill in missing values in the SIP. So for instance, if someone does not answer information about how much they made, maybe we go and pull all of their W-2s from IRS data, take that and fill it in the SIP. So as you can imagine, this would be pretty cost efficient. We wouldn't have to go back and ask more follow-up questions to try and get the answers. Maybe there's less burden on respondents. They don't have to go digging through their paperwork to look at up information about like assets or something like that. In some Scandinavian countries, they've been pretty successful, producing statistics from administrative data. But we don't live in an ideal world, right? So we can't use straight administrative data and replace that in the SIP for a number of different reasons. Number one is the universe and the questions don't always line up. So the questions that we ask on SIP might be slightly different than the information that is in the administrative data. The second issue is there is no administrative data on informal workers or other information where there isn't a paper trail. So if I'm working under the table, there's no record of me anywhere in the administrative data. Then the third issue, and probably the most important, is we work with a lot of external agencies to get administrative data. And there's always a balancing act between the public perception of security and using individuals' data on the survey. So for instance, for the IRS, public trust and data privacy is really, really important for tax compliance. And then there's also disclosure risk. Because SIP is such a huge survey, if we take all of the information that we get and just replace those values, it might be the case that someone who is looking to identify a specific person could use that, specific information and to get information about them from the SIP. So we don't want that. So our solution is to use model-based imputation, and we use administrative data as inputs. It's important to note here that the administrative data are inputs only in our modeling process, and so you won't see any of the administrative data in the actual SIP that you see today. So we take information from the SIP, everything that we have about individuals, demographics and things like that. We combine it with all of our nice administrative data that we get from several different agencies, combine them in a model, and you'll see the final imputations in the SIP. So what kind of administrative data do we have? Right now, we pull administrative data for imputations from a couple of different sources. We have 4 main files from the SSA, and each of those files gives us slightly different information on things like earnings and disability, retirement, Medicare, that kind of thing. We also pull W-2s from the IRS for supplementary information on the number of jobs people work, if they have deferred earnings and that kind of thing. And then we also use the census NUMIDENT, which is basically a near universe of all birth and death rate records for anyone that's had any sort of interaction with the Social Security Administration. So we have all this in administrative records in the hopes that, all of these data sources will help alleviate a little bit of that not missing at random or the non-response bias that we have in the SIP. So we have the records. We also need a way to link them to people in the SIP. In order for us to link SIP respondents to administrative records, we have to have a protected identification key. And the reason why is because the SIP doesn't ask for Social Security numbers. So we need to be able to match to these records based on the information that we do have. And so this is things like name, date of birth, sex, address, and that kind of thing. And then we use a probabilistic matching system to assign each person a pick. The good news is that there's a really high pick rate in the SIP. So for example, the 2021 panel, the pick rate was about 94%. So generally 94% of people in the SIP we can link to administrative records if they are available. So this, now that we have the linkage and we have all of our administrative records, it kind of leads into the second challenge that we talked about at the beginning is, well, how do we reduce processing time? So as you can imagine, to use model-based imputation for tons of different questions that the SIP asks can be really computationally intensive. It can take a long time. So the solution to this is to introduce topic flags. A topic flag is basically just an indicator variable for all of the major topics covered in the SIP. Each topic has its own screener question that determines if a respondent is going to be asked all of the follow-up questions. So for example, here on the screen, we're talking about the topic flag for a job, right? So do you currently have a job, or have you worked at all since the beginning of the reference period? If the person answers yes, they get all of the follow-up questions for. So things like, how many hours did you work? How much did you get paid? What is your schedule like? And things like that. So for imputation, we first impute the yes, no topic flags. If it's imputed to be a 1, then we go on and impute all of the follow-up questions. And the idea is to reduce this processing time so we can still go through this. Ruth is going to talk a little bit about all of the different topic flags that we impute. But now I'm going to hand it over to her because she's going to talk about the challenge of creating a better way to model missing data.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. So as Jennifer said, we addressed the first challenge we have by getting administrative data. So we've got some better data for our inputs. And then we addressed the second challenge of processing time by creating these topic flags. So any of this new model-based imputation is only going to be used with the topic flags. However, we still have the issue of how are we going to model and how are we going to actually impute this missing data? And so for this, with the 2014 redesign, we turned to sequential regression multivariate imputation, or SRMI. It's a multivariate technique to impute missing data that was developed by Raghu and his co-authors back in 2001. And today I'm going to give you a pretty high-level overview of how this works. But if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, I really recommend the paper. All right, next slide, please. So this high-level overview. We're going to start with some variables X, and these variables aren't missing on any data. And then we have some variables Y1 through YK, and there's going to be pockets of missing data scattered throughout here. Now, importantly, this missingness is non-monotonic, meaning that there's just kind of randomly scattered throughout the data, and it is not the case, for example, that Y3 has more missing data than Y2. So what we do here is we're going to start by imputing Y1. And we do that by building a regression equation on the complete data cases of Y1 and regressing it on X. Then we use that regression equation to impute missing values on Y1. Once we're done with that, we continue on with Y2, but now we're going to create this regression equation by regressing Y2 on X and Y1, because again, Y1 doesn't have any missing data anymore because it's been fully imputed. So when we build this regression equation, we fill in missing data on Y2, and then we continue through Y3 through YK, building our regression equations based on X and all previously imputed Y variables. Once we get all the way through with imputing YK this way, one iteration is complete. Next slide, please. However, it's called sequential regression multivariate imputation. So you might think that we're not going to stop here, and you would be right. So now we're going to go back to Y1, and we're going to delete those previously imputed variables, and we're going to build a whole new regression equation to impute new values for it. But now this time, instead of just regressing Y1 on X, we can regress Y1 on X and all our other Y variables. Because remember, all our Y variables now don't have any missing data anymore because they were filled in the first iteration. So we build a totally new regression equation, and using this regression equation, we can impute new values of Y1 on any time it's missing. Next, we go to Y2 and the same thing. We're going to delete our previously imputed values and build a new regression equation on X, on the Y1 values of the second iteration, and then the Y3 through YK values of the first iteration. So in general, anytime we're imputing missing data, we're going to build our regression equation on X, and then whatever the most recently imputed value was of the other Y variables. Next slide. Again, we go through this process, Y3 through YK, and we're going to do this several times, which begs the question, how many iterations is enough? Like, how many times do we go through this? Well, there's no perfect answer, obviously, or in many cases, obviously, there's going to be no perfect answer. And there's kind of this balancing act, because increasing the number of iterations is going to get more stable estimates. And it's also going to eliminate order effects. So if you have sufficient number of iterations, this imputation method is going to work just as well for Y1 as it does for YK. However, increasing the number of iterations is also going to increase processing time. And this can be really prohibitive in a big survey like the SIP, where you have a lot of different variables that you need to impute. So what we've done at Census to kind of balance these two needs is that most times when we see a data set, we are going to use 5 iterations. Previous research has shown that it's probably good enough, sufficient number of iterations to get stable estimates and eliminate order effects, and doesn't take super long. And then on our last data run, so the last time we impute values for a specific data set, we're going to use 10 iterations, because 10 iterations is definitely good enough. And even though it increases processing time, since we're only doing it once, we've decided that is a valuable trade-off. All right, the last thing I want to mention here about these SRMI models is that it's really important to remember that the regression equations are not causal. That is, we're not trying to come up with some, social science paper that uses explanatory variable X to explain the world Y. Like, we're not interested in that. All we're interested in doing is exploiting correlations in the data to fill in these missing values. I had a professor back at grad school who liked to say all the world is correlated at 0.3. So we just want to get all of those 0.3 correlations and use them to fill in missing data. Next slide, please. All right, so once we do this SRMI at the census, we've kind of put our own specific flair on it in 2 different ways. The first is in choosing regressors for these missing data imputation models. With a survey like the SIP, you are going to have a lot of Y values and a lot of X values that probably don't have anything to do with the variable you're currently imputing. And when you have too many regressors in the model, you can run into issues of complete or quasi-separation of the data, which can lead to unstable estimates. So what we've done is we've automated the process and we trim our regression equations using stepwise selection. The cutoff we currently use is p-values of 0.1 or less are regressors that remain in the model. So it's important to remember here that every variable we impute has the same possible regressors that could go into the model, but not every variable is going to end up with the exact same regressors in its model. So that's with regressors. Then the kind of second flair we put on it is with stratifiers. So with this, prior to SRMI, prior to imputing any of this missing data, we are going to first divide all of our respondents into homogeneous subgroups using categorical variables or stratifiers. And this process is essentially hot decking, right? So you might have a group, one of your homogeneous subgroups is going to be women aged 25 to 35 with a job. And then another of your groups is going to be women aged 25 to 35 without a job. Each of the to be imputed variables is going to have a different set of stratifiers that are going to be particularly salient for that variable. And the choice of stratifiers, we work with our subject matter experts to pick these out, and they should be highly correlated with the outcome variable. But you also should be thinking about potential interactions with other model regressors. So for example, let's say we are modeling the amount of money you have in your retirement account, and we think income is going to be an important predictor of that amount of money. However, you might think that the effective income is going to be different from men versus women in which case you're going to want gender to be one of the stratifiers. Now, the reason why this is important is that each of these homogeneous subgroups is going to get its own regression equation, right? So the regression equation for men is going to look a little bit different, or potentially going to look a little bit different than the regression equation for women. And we do this for two reasons. The first is that, the hope is that we can build better fitting regression models when we use these homogeneous subgroups. But the second issue is that in a survey like the SIP, you're going to have some variables with really low, really poor distribution of the data. So you might have some program that has really low uptake, like not very many people participate in it, in which case building a regression model is not going to be very good. You're not going to get good model fit. And in cases like that, what we do is we fill in missing data with bootstrapping. And so since we already have our data divided into these homogeneous subgroups, our bootstrap values are, again, hopefully going to be better imputed values of our missing data. Next slide, please. One of the cool things about SRMI is that all of your regression models can look totally different from one another. So if we have binary variables, like most of our topic flags are, we can impute using logistic regression equations, but we do also impute some continuous variables. So linear regression works just as well. And then we do have some multinomial regressions. And like I said, we sometimes use Bayes bootstrapping. Next slide. And in fact, this customization is one of the really wonderful benefits of SRMI. In addition to being able to being able to easily handle different types of variables, SRMI is also really good at handling when different variables have differing universes, or for instance, when you are trying to impute within a logical bound. So let's say somebody's asked how much money they make at their job, and they don't give you an exact answer, but they tell you it's between $50,000 and $70,000. Well, in that case, SRMI is really easy. It's really easily able to be updated to make sure that the imputed value is within 50 to 70,000. The second great benefit of SRMI is that you can condition on a lot of predictor variables. So as Jennifer was talking about hot decking, you can get some categorical variables, but not a whole lot of them. And you couldn't use continuous variables unless you categorized them. With SRMI, you can have a whole lot of different predictor variables in your model, and you can use continuous variables. And then lastly here, SRMI is really good at estimating a joint distribution of these variables. So other imputation methods could be really good at preserving a univariate distribution, but SRMI is really good at preserving the multivariate distribution. And then also it's good for disclosure purposes. Next slide, please. However, the big thing that SRMI is really wonderful at, and the reason why we spent so much time talking about the admin variables at the top of this talk, is because SRMI can easily incorporate administrative records. So we use these administrative records as predictors in our imputation models. And one of the reasons why they're so wonderful is because they're really highly correlated with a lot of the SIP data that we need to impute. So for instance, the detailed earnings record is going to be really valuable when we're trying to impute work-related variables. Similarly, when we're trying to impute some means-tested programs, so these are programs where income, some sort of income threshold determines eligibility, these IRS data is going to be really valuable in imputing the mean-tested programs. And as Jennifer said, this admin data is not subject to non-response bias, so it can be a really good external set of data to help us improve the quality of our imputations. However, you might be thinking, well, Jennifer said that only 94% of participants are able to have their records linked to admin records. So what do we do with the other 6%? In that case, we are going to impute their admin variables with SRMI, just like we impute all the other missing data. So kind of the order of operations is that like our Y1 through Y10 variables or whatever are going to be administrative variables, and then Y11 through Y5 billion not that many, I'm an exaggerator, is going to be our topic flags, and then y 5 billion plus are going to be all our continuous variables. But again, because this process is iterative, once we do our continuous variables, we come back, re-impute admin variables, etc. Next slide, please. However, as with everything, there's no perfect imputation model. SRMI does have some limitations. And the big one that we've already mentioned a couple times is in processing time. When we do our 5 iteration imputation models, it can take up to 15 hours to do that. And when we do our 10 iteration SRMI runs, it can take over 24 hours. And that's assuming that everything goes exactly right. If there's an error, then we need to troubleshoot and change things, update things, rerun. It's going to take a lot longer. Because of that, that's one of the reasons that we've limited SRMI to just topic flags, or mostly just topic flags. And then the other thing I want to mention here is, like Jennifer said, we are getting this wonderful admin data from these other governmental agencies, but there's lots of privacy and confidentiality concerns, and we take that really seriously. And so we can only run these models on a certain very secure data server that's different than our regular servers at Census. And so there's just some logistical consideration with moving data back and forth in order to be processed. Next slide, please. All right, and just in case you don't believe me that SRMI is wonderful, we put together this little chart to kind of illustrate the differences between the SRMI that we currently use and hot decking, which we previously used a lot in the SIP. As you can see, there are a bunch of differences, but I've highlighted the administrative records because, again, when we use these administrative records, we can control for like that non-response by, or the not missing at randomness problem that Jennifer mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. All right, so now we've got all our data imputed with SRMI. You might think we're done. We're not done. There's a couple of post-imputation methods that I also want to walk you through here. And the first is what happens when one variable that needs to be imputed sets the universe for another variable. So for instance, parenthood screeners and the child tax credit receipt. So only people who are parents are eligible to receive the child tax credit. But if your parenthood screener is missing, what do you do? In these cases, we set that respondent to be in universe for both of the variables, and we impute both of them. But then after imputation, we do a post-correction edit where we make sure that the second variable is in line with the first. So in this instance, if the parenthood screener was imputed to be no, so you're not a parent, it doesn't matter what the CTC says, we are going to change that to be out of universe. However, if the parenthood screener was imputed to be yes, then we keep the imputed value from the child tax credit. So that's one of our post-imputation edits. And then the other one I want to talk about is with program confusion. And this is most prevalent with Social Security income, so old age, survivor, and disability benefits, and supplemental security income. And so they're 2 different programs. However, they're both colloquially known as Social Security. So oftentimes when respondents are answering, did you get SSI? They think yes, even though what they actually got was Social Security. And in fact, this problem is so prevalent that if we didn't do this edit, the distribution of recipients was going to be way off. So what we do is for anybody who said they got supplemental security, we look at their admin records. If they did get, if their admin records say they got supplemental security, then great, no problem. However, if they didn't get SSI, but they did get Social Security, we assume that they made a mistake and we change their value from SSI to be no and their Social Security value to be yes. And then we also do the opposite edit. If they say they got Social Security, but the admin record shows they actually got SSI, we also change it that way. Next slide, please. All right, so like Jennifer said, when we first started this back in 2014, we were mostly only doing topic flags. However, the process works so well that we've expanded our SRMI variables a couple different times. So the first was in 2018 when we added a whole slew of continuous variables pertaining to assets, earnings, liabilities, all that sort of thing. And then again in 2021, we added another bunch of variables related to retirement. So when we first started this process back in 2014, we were only imputing 38 variables. Now we're up to 103. And that's great. We love SRMI. We want to use it more. But like we were saying, we do run into some issues with processing time, which I'll come back to in a second. Next slide, please. All right, I'm not going to read this whole chart to you, but it is a list of variables that we imputed with SRMI in 2021. This is available in the SIP user guide, which you can find on the Census website. So if you are interested in which variables specifically were imputed this way, I encourage you to look there. Next slide, please. All right, lastly, where do we go from here? Well, the first way we want to expand this is to continuously and gradually add more variables that we're going to impute with SRMI. However, as we've been harping on this whole time, there are these time constraints. So we want to be really thoughtful about which variables we choose for this process. And in general, those variables are going to be those that are really highly correlated with the admin variables, because we're going to kind of get the most bang for our buck by imputing those variables with SRMI. And then the second way that we're always continuously looking to improve this is with new, different sources of auxiliary, I can't say that word right now, new data sources, new administrative data sources, and new variables from existing sources. All right, next slide. And that is it. We have some time for questions, but we also have our contact information here. So, you know, if you're lying in bed later tonight and just ruminating on how SRMI works or all the admin variables, feel free to reach out to either one of us. But we are ready for your questions now, if anybody has them.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Ruth. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I just wanted to remind the audience that they can use the icon in the ribbon below to raise their hands, and then Anthony could unmute them so that they can ask their questions verbally.
And if you do happen to be shy, we are available via email. We just are really hoping that this model-based imputation becomes less of a black box and a little bit more accessible.
I want to definitely thank you guys for a great presentation. And, you know, folks don't realize the old type Z imputation only had 7 variables that it crossed things by, and how much better, you know, this is, and how much it has matured since, you know, we sat there and said, hey, let's take a try at doing this and using the admin data. It is fantastic, and you guys have really moved the ball forward a lot. You know, survey non-response is going to continue to be an issue, and data quality is going to be enhanced by imputation methods like this, where we can have a distribution of data from the non-respondents, you know, and that's really critical. And you know, those who answer surveys are different than those from folks that don't answer surveys. And, you know, this type of method is really important. And I'm really glad that you and the branch are pushing it forward.
Since I don't see anyone else's raising their hand, I will just ask a question to start some discussion about this. So are there any types of variables that SRMI would be more suited for imputing? So I know you mentioned using SRMI for imputing and the topic flags, and those are just binary variables. Would SRMI work equally well when we are talking about imputing continuous variables? Or does it perform better with binary variables?
No, it performs great with all types of variables. And that's one of the really wonderful strengths of this type of imputation method is that, you know, as we're looking for new variables to impute or for any particular variable that we are trying to increase the imputation quality, SRMI is in general going to be good for any kind of variable you can throw at us.
So what topics would you guys put on the list of things we should look at next?
Of different variables we're going to impute, or
different variables or types of variables, things that we haven't tackled yet?
I don't know that I have a list. Something I've been thinking about lately that we don't. This is a Ruth Seraphin pipe dream, so nobody take this to the bank, okay? But I was talking about how we use selection to trim our models, stepwise selection to trim our models. Well, when we built this process back in 2014, it was my understanding that there wasn't a lot of research about, you know, what stepwise selection, forward selection, should we use something else? I think it would be really cool to run some simulation studies and do some comparisons of different ways of trimming models. So maybe, you know, lasso or ridge regression techniques. It's not clear to me that it would be any better, but I think that would be an interesting area of future research.
Let me ask you guys one other question, well, maybe more than one, but I'll do this one now. I think a lot about what other admin data we might want to bring into the picture. And, you know, things like, you know, SNAP comes to mind, right? But we don't have it for every state. You know, can you think about, are there, I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. There are ways we could use SRMI for the states that we do have SNAP, or the with and without, to bring in partial admin data and make it useful and make it tell us something. What do you think?
Well, so Rachel put in the chat that we are in the process of incorporating some new administrative records. Mostly, so SNAP and TANF are definite possibilities, you know, but of course there's the whole, you know, the universe doesn't line up. So what do? Well, it is possible that we could impute the administrative data for the states that we don't have and run it. One of the other interesting things is how do we best impute self-employment, right? Because it's hard to get a record of self-employment because sometimes people don't have any employees, and you know, or they don't have an EIN, or you know, like how do we capture self-employment in the best way? So we're really kind of thinking about like the low-hanging fruit and like what data sources can we bring in to try and capture some of those variables. But I do agree, like SNAP and TANF, like I think could be done. Again, so it's, as Ruth says, it's like a balancing act. Like how long is this going to run for? Like, you know, because we have processing schedules and we need to make sure that the analysts get, you know, enough time to evaluate all of these variables and everything like that. But I mean, as long as there's something that is closely correlated in the administrative data, there's like really no restrictions except time. So.
And I know in the past we've used lag data as well. So recency is another big issue with administrative data. It takes forever to get some of them in, and then we don't necessarily get them all on a flow basis. I don't think SSA knew what they were getting into when we started putting this into production, and we're like, hey, come on, we need the data now. So
right, and there's some instances where we can only use lag data, and so again, in the model, it's correlation, right? We're not replacing it, so we're just getting a best estimate. But yeah, the timing is key, and with agencies and data sharing, sometimes the timing does not work out.
Great. Well, I will stop hogging all the questions and leave it open for other folks. So Shalise, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. No, I saw that Raghu had his hand up momentarily, but so I'm just going, yeah, so I see his hand back up again. So Anthony, could you please unmute him so he can ask his question, please?
Your line should be open now. Do you hear us?
And I really enjoyed it.
But I'll start over with your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so have you tried this SRMI on a longitudinal component where you are imputing the longitudinal data, or is it just a cross-sectional data?
So far, it's just been cross-sectional data, but we do, well, before we impute, we merge the SIP with previous panels. So anybody who is in previous panel, their previous wave data can be used as inputs in our SRMI models. So even though we're only doing cross-sectional stuff, we can still kind of draw on previous data, previous values, and use that to increase the quality of our imputations.
Wonderful. Thank you.
There's also a question in the chat, so I'll just read it out. Since many people misreport the receipt of items like a SNAP, can you use SRMI to impute these misreports as well?
Yeah, so this is getting a little bit at the program confusion stuff I was talking about. Sorry, my cat is trying to jump into my video, so if I'm looking away from my screen, that's why. Sorry, so I off the top of my head, I don't remember if we do any post-imputations or post-imputation corrections with SNAP currently, but that data is available for us like we do with the SSI Social Security edits. I don't know if Jennifer remembers off the top of her head if we do corrections with SNAP.
For both SNAP and TANF, it would kind of be a big undertaking to start imputing those variables. I mean, we're up to the challenge, but like Ruth said, I think in the last slide, it's like, you know, gradually increasing and picking the variables that probably, you know, have, so with SNAP and TANF, like we don't have access to all of the states and timing and things like that. So generally we try to focus on variables where we have all of the information from the administrative records that we do have now. But in the future, I can definitely see us growing it to a point where we start incorporating some of these other variables.
Thank you very much, Jennifer and Ruth. Are there any other questions? If there are, again, please either raise your hand and put them in the chat. While our audience are thinking about their questions, I'll just ask one myself. So in terms of the variables that we can use in the model, can we talk a little bit about the selection process? I know you mentioned, Ruth, that we use a stepwise selection, but can we talk about the order, like the processing order? Are the variables have to be imputed before the variables that we're imputing for SRMI? Can we select those variables from anywhere on the server, or they should be variables that have been edited, processed before the questions that we encounter and we want to edit? Sorry, maybe some of these questions might be obvious for our audience, but if we can go over them.
Sorry, so can you repeat your question?
Yes, for sure. So let's say that we want to impute a variable, and so some variables would go into the model for imputing that variable. And from where in the survey do we choose those variables? Are those variables that have been previously imputed and edited? and therefore came prior to these variables that we want to impute, or we can select these variables from anywhere in the survey. And how does that variable selection really affect the quality of our imputations?
Yeah, okay. So I think in most cases, the variables that we use as regressors are either variables that have been edited previous to when it comes to us, so upstream in the process, or other variables that we also impute. However, like we were saying, and we, like I said earlier, we use some previous wave variables, right? We also use like what your spouse is doing. So if your spouse gets a specific program participation, we can use that as a regressor as well. If your parents do, that sort of thing. So we have just like this whole variety of possible regressors that you can put into a model. That doesn't mean that our models are going to be perfect. There's always the issue with misspecification, but for a large part, these models have gone through a lot of different refinement periods to pick out the best stratifiers, to kind of get the best inputs into the model. So I think for the most part, the imputation quality is pretty high, and that's consistent through a lot of the variables that we impute. There's some differing quality, again, depending on how good the inputs are, how good the administrative records are. Like Jennifer was saying, sometimes we're missing records for some people, or we don't have perfect records for some variables. And so quality can differ a little bit in that respect. But for the most part, we already have like so much information about our respondents that our model quality is pretty good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that response. There is also a comment in the chat from Jason Fields. Jason, do you want to just unmute yourself and say that comment verbally, or do you want me to just read it?
Sure. I was just commenting basically on what Ruth was saying. Compared to the way we took matching donors from other records across households, being able to use the within household relationships is huge. I mean, it's just so much of a step improvement in data quality and internal coherence within the imputed data. Yeah.
Thank you for reemphasizing that, Jason. We can give a couple of more minutes for people to ask questions, and then I'm just going to quickly provide an overview of the program tomorrow and what to expect, and then we'll see if there is more to discuss on SRMI.
Yeah, and as we said, we have that slide with our contact information. If people are thinking they have more questions later on, they think of different things they want to ask us about, feel free to email us. We are happy to get back to you.
Thank you. That's great.
So I have a question. This is Mark. So I think I heard you mention, so I know this, but I think I heard you mention in the talk that for people who can't be linked to administrative records, we impute their administrative records prior to SRMI. Have we done any kind of investigation into like the characteristics of those imputed values compared to people who we have actual AdRec data for, to like get a sense of how confident we should be in something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. To my knowledge, we haven't done any investigation like that, but I think that is, yeah, a really important question, and definitely a really worthwhile kind of area of future research.
All right, so why don't we take a pause in the question so I can just briefly provide an overview of the program tomorrow. So tomorrow we'll start at 8:30 Eastern with opening remarks by Dr. Jason Fields, our senior SIP researcher, who will provide an overview and reflection on the sessions that we had today. We will then have a total of 6 presentation sessions throughout the day, as well as a listening session in midday, where we really want to hear from our data users about the strengths and weaknesses of the SIP, what really works for them in their research, and what they would like to see improved in the data, so that they can continue taking advantage of the SIP in their research. So please, if you have any comments for us, make sure that you attend that session in the afternoon. We send all attendees a set of prompts for that session, but don't feel restricted to those prompts. Feel free to provide your comments in any format that you like. After the listening session, we will continue with the rest of the paper sessions that we have tomorrow. And we will end our second day of and final day of conference with a 30-minute virtual reception, just to provide relaxed virtual environment for everyone to network and chat and talk, and without the pressure of presenting, answering questions. So we hope to see you there as well. But I want to just again shift the focus back to SRMI, the use of ADREX in the SIP, and see if we have any last minute questions for Jennifer and Ruth. If not, again, please feel free to reach them via email, but this is a great place to ask them questions.
I think it's dinner time.
I agree. So thank you again, Jennifer, Ruth. You did an amazing job. I personally learned so much from you, and this is the second time I saw your presentation. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone to our audience. We hope to see you tomorrow at 8:30 Eastern.